If a country can turn freezing to death into a national advantage, what else have we been calling impossible just because we never had to live with it? Finland doesn't just survive winter. It treats it like a system test for the entire nation. And that changes everything about how you think about security. Because once you realize preparation is a culture, not a policy, the whole conversation about NATO, borders, and resilience hits completely different. So let's get into why that mindset exists and what it reveals about the world right now. Bro, Finland treating winter like a hostile country is insane. Like -40 and they are just casually calling it Tuesday. But that is the whole thing. They are not dramatizing it at all. They are just like, this is geography, deal with it. And that makes the whole NATO angle feel way more real. Because this is not some abstract alliance talk, this is actual cold, actual border, actual snow. Snow that can apparently kill you faster than politics. That line should be on a poster in the base. The crazy part is, they have built an entire national mindset around being ready. Not paranoid, just permanently prepared. Which is such a different vibe from most countries that just hope for the best. Dude, the reserve system alone is wild. Like the idea that so many people can just fold back into defense service is serious nation design. In some places, people barely know where their passport is, and these guys are ready for war in the snow. Europe said brunch is canceled. Everybody learned to ski and carry gear. But it is not funny when you think about the history behind it. That memory of being vulnerable to Russia is doing a lot of work. And that is why the bunkers and all the readiness are not theater. It is like a national immune system that never switches off. Wait, the skiing part is actually incredible, though. Imagine training to fight and glide at the same time. That is such a ridiculous advantage in that terrain. If you are the wrong army, the forest and snow are basically on Finland's payroll. The environment itself is defending the country. And that is why NATO showing up there matters so much. It is not just soldiers learning a new map, it is them learning a whole survival logic. Because the moment logistics fail in that weather, the whole fantasy dies. Tanks, food, clothes, batteries, everything becomes a war issue. Even your socks are now strategic assets. Honestly, the clothes-fitting segment was probably more intense than some startup demos. Like, this is what military power actually looks like before the action. 100 boring systems working so one hard moment does not break you. Which is hilarious because people always imagine war as just explosions and speeches. But it is mostly weather, planning, and not freezing to death. That is such an unglamorous truth. And then you have the Americans landing from Alaska, which is such a movie scene. Like, of course, the 11th Airborne is showing up in the Arctic. That collaboration is where it gets geopolitically spicy. Because now it is not Finland alone thinking about the East, it is a whole alliance. Russia definitely notices that kind of signaling. And probably hates every second of it. Which is basically the point of alliances, if we are being honest. Quietly make the other guy reconsider his mood. What I keep thinking about is how calm the country seems on the surface. Like everybody is polite, quiet, almost minimal. But underneath that is this insane readiness culture. That contrast is what makes it so fascinating. The happiest people in the world with a bunker mentality is such a plot twist. Happiness and contingency planning, what a combo. But maybe that is the secret, not pretending danger is gone. Just building a society that can absorb shocks without panicking. That feels more mature than most countries, honestly. And the reporter being out there sleeping in snow is part of selling that reality. Imagine signing up for journalism and ending up in an Arctic endurance test. He wanted a story and got frostbite with context. Brutal but fair. Yet that first-hand exposure matters because this stuff is impossible to feel from a distance. You need the cold, the gear, the silence, the waiting. Otherwise, it just sounds like some abstract defense policy talk. Here it feels like survival architecture. And honestly, that is why this story is so compelling. It is not just about Russia or NATO. It is about what a country becomes when it lives near the edge. The edge changes your personality as a nation. You do not get to be casual when the frontier is literally your backyard. Your backyard is apparently an operational theater. That sounds terrible and also weirdly impressive. I think the most interesting question is whether constant readiness makes people safer or just more alert. Probably both, but it also probably changes how you think day to day. Like danger becomes background noise. And maybe that is the price of living there. Still, I respect how practical it is. No speeches, just preparation, discipline, and ugly weather. Very unsexy, very effective. That might be the whole thesis of Finland, honestly. Not loud power, just quietly making invasion a nightmare. The most polite deterrent on Earth. And somehow that politeness makes it scarier, because it means they are not bluffing. They are just ready all the time. Honestly, that is a pretty strong national strategy. That part about skiing into war is insane to me. Like, imagine your military doctrine starts with, grab your skis. But it is not cute, because the terrain is basically the enemy too. Yeah, cold is not a vibe, cold is an opponent. And Finland looked at that and said, fine, we will train for the weather. That is such a different mindset from most countries. Most places build around comfort, and they built around survival. -40 and they are still like, good, let us drill. Honestly, that is the kind of sentence that makes generals happy and civilians cry. Bro, the gear alone looked like a hostage situation. 30 or 40 pounds just to walk outside is wild. And that layering thing matters because one mistake becomes a medical emergency. Which is why their whole army culture feels so practical. No drama, no swagger, just do the thing that keeps you alive. That is the least cinematic army vibe possible, and somehow the coolest one. And the reserve system is a big piece of that, right? Because they are not pretending a tiny active force can carry the whole country. They have built a society where everybody kind of knows their role. That is the part that feels old and modern at the same time. Like your civilian life is just waiting in the background for crisis mode, which is either incredibly healthy or deeply stressful. Probably both, which is very Scandinavian of them. And then there is the history underneath it, which changes everything. You can feel that this is not paranoia out of nowhere. It is memory turned into policy. That is the eerie part, because memory can outlive the people who had it. So the country keeps rehearsing for a chapter it never wants to write again. And Russia being right there makes that rehearsal feel less theoretical. A 1,000-kilometer border is just enormous. You cannot fake security on a border like that. You either invest in readiness or you gamble with geography. Finland clearly hates gambling. Yeah, they look like the kind of people who would bet on weather forecasts and maps. And that NATO exercise is really the other big story here. Because this is not just Finland training alone anymore. This is Americans, Canadians, Nordics, all trying to learn the same frozen nightmare. International cooperation, but make it freezing. I love that the alliance meeting point is just, do you know how to not die here? And honestly, that is probably what makes the alliance feel real. Shared hardship is a lot more convincing than speeches. Because a lot of alliances are just flags and press conferences. Here it is boots in snow, which is a much better test. Even the airfield drop sounds brutal. Guys landing from Alaska and then immediately acting like it is wartime, that is intense. It forces everyone to think past peacetime habits. Peacetime habits are where people get lazy. And Finland seems allergic to laziness when it comes to defense. Which again, very efficient, very annoying to invade. What I find interesting is how calm the whole thing looks. No chest thumping, no weird macho theater. Just competence, repetition, and cold weather. And somehow that feels more threatening than loud nationalism. Loud nationalism usually needs a soundtrack. Finland's soundtrack is just wind and footsteps. But that also connects to why they are so disciplined socially. If your country lives with this level of preparedness, it changes the culture. You start treating resilience like a normal habit. And then people call you the happiest country in the world, which is funny. Because happiness here is probably not about being carefree. It is about not being surprised by life. That is a huge difference. A lot of people want bliss, Finland wants readiness. And readiness is apparently the path to bliss, somehow. That should not work, but it kind of does. The bummer is, that mindset only exists because history keeps tapping them on the shoulder. You do not train like that for fun. You train like that because forgetting would be dangerous. And that is what makes the bunker stuff so revealing. It is not just an army project, it is a national habit. Most countries do not think about civil defense at that level anymore. Finland kind of never stopped. Which makes the whole thing feel less like preparation and more like identity. And identity is harder to fake than equipment. Yeah, you can buy jackets, you cannot buy national memory. That is why the exercise matters beyond the military. It is a signal to Moscow, but also a signal to themselves. We remember we are ready, we are not panicking, which is a very Finnish sentence if you think about it. It really is the calmest warning label ever. And I think that is why this whole story works so well. It is not about one battle. It is about how a country organizes fear. Not into panic, but into competence. That is the real flex. The flex is being impossible to catch off guard, which is probably the only sustainable flex in geopolitics. And maybe that is why the country feels so composed from the outside, because underneath the calm is a system that has already imagined the bad day. That is a heavy way to live, but also a very smart one. Heavy, smart, and apparently excellent at skiing. That might be the most Finnish summary possible. Yeah, and honestly, it leaves you with respect instead of fear-mongering, because they are not trying to sound tough. They are trying to be tough where it counts. That difference changes everything. And that starts with the weirdest detail, which is the clothing room. Imagine a country where putting on socks is national security. But honestly, that is the whole philosophy right there. If your body fails in -40, the bullets are almost secondary. That captain with the map obsession felt like such a Finland thing. Of course, the Arctic warfare guy is passionate about maps. Bro probably sleeps with contour lines under his pillow. And then the layers, man, the layers look like a ritual. It is not gear, it is a system to keep your brain functioning. That is what people miss when they think of military strength. It is not just weapons, it is endurance before anything else. Also, the orange bag of doom was ridiculous. That thing looked like it could contain either survival gear or a small apartment. And they just casually handed over like, welcome to winter hell. What hit me harder was the reserve mindset. Like, they do not treat service as a side note to citizenship. That changes the entire national psychology. Everyone knows the country has already thought through the worst case. So readiness is not a mood, it is infrastructure. They basically turned paranoia into a public utility. Honest to God, maybe that is why they look so calm. Because if you have trained for the bad day, you do not perform panic. And that reserve army piece is enormous in this story. It means the military is not a separate world from society. It is just baked into the country like plumbing. Great comparison, by the way, Finland as military plumbing. No, but seriously, that is why it feels durable. Because the system does not depend on hype or hero worship. It depends on repetition, discipline, and boring competence, which weirdly is way scarier than loud macho talk. Loud macho talk usually collapses the second the snow gets real. Exactly, and that is why the Arctic matters so much now. The geography is doing half the political work for them. A 1,000-kilometer border does not let you relax ever. And Russia being right there makes every detail heavier. Not just militarily, emotionally too. That history sits inside the country whether people talk about it or not. That is what makes the happy country thing so interesting. Imagine being ranked happiest while also preparing for Arctic war. That is such an insane sentence on paper. But maybe happiness is partly trust in the system. Like people are not naive, they are secure. Or at least secure enough to function without constant drama. Which is already more than most countries can say. The NATO piece is huge too, though. This is not just Finland alone in the snow anymore. You have Americans, Canadians, Nordics all out there. A frozen group project with actual consequences. And the funny part is, the climate becomes the equalizer. Nobody gets to swagger too hard when your eyelashes freeze. Bro, the snow is the real commander. That is probably why joint exercises matter so much. Because allied forces do not just need weapons compatibility. They need weather compatibility, survival compatibility, ego compatibility. Ego compatibility is a beautiful phrase. Half of military cooperation is just not being unbearable. And that commander line about the most efficient unit stood out to me. Every army says that about itself, obviously. Yeah, armies are basically linked in with camouflage. But in this case, the environment actually tests the claim. You cannot fake competence when the cold punishes everything sloppy. The cold is almost morally honest. It exposes whether your training is real or just branding. And that is why the boot camp stuff felt so visceral. Sleeping in snow, moving through forests, all of it builds instinct. Not just muscle memory, but weather memory. Weather memory sounds fake until you see it happen. The body starts understanding danger before the mind finishes explaining it. That is a wild level of preparation. And yet it is weirdly ordinary for them. Which is the scariest part. Right, because normalizing extreme readiness is the whole trick. If panic feels abnormal, the country stays stable. But I do wonder about the cost of always being this alert. Like, can a society stay open and warm while always preparing for impact? That is the real tension under all the snow. Because resilience can become a personality. And then you start confusing stoicism with health. Exactly, the line between disciplined and hardened is thin. Still, the report made it feel less like militarism and more like inheritance. Like the country learned the price of being unprepared. And never fully forgot. Honestly, forgetting would be a luxury there. So the calm faces, the ski training, the reserves, the bunkers, it all connects. It is a national promise to not be caught sleeping. And that is why this feels bigger than one military exercise. It is a whole way of living with risk without becoming consumed by it. Which frankly is way harder than fighting the war itself. Or maybe it is how you avoid the war in the first place. Yeah, that might be the real lesson here. Not fear, not bravado, just readiness with a face on it. A very cold face, but still a face. But wait, imagine your entire national identity being built around not getting surprised. That is such a wild sentence to live inside. And it is not paranoia, it feels like discipline. Right, because paranoia makes you sloppy and they seem weirdly precise. Exactly, like even the clothing is a strategy, not just gear. In -40, fashion becomes a life or death system. Bro, your outfit is basically a military operation. And that makes me think the whole army is trained to respect basics. Yeah, not heroic nonsense, just layers, maps, survival, repetition. Which is honestly annoying because it is so unglamorous. Nobody wants to hear that preparedness is mostly boring. But boring is exactly what keeps people alive. And that reserves model is the part that keeps hitting me. Millions of people knowing they might be called up is insane. It turns defense into a social habit, not just a government function. Still, that has to change the mood of a country a lot. Maybe. But it also probably removes the fantasy of being helpless. Yeah, helplessness is expensive, emotionally and militarily. What I love is they do not seem theatrical about it. No war drums, just actual drums of preparation. That was awful, but I respect it. And then you add NATO and the scale gets ridiculous. Because now Finland is not just protecting itself, it is teaching others. That is such a reversal from the usual small country story. Usually smaller countries just plead for guarantees and pray. Here they are saying, no, we have useful knowledge too. And the useful knowledge is literally surviving hell weather. Which honestly is a pretty good export. The Arctic part matters more than people think too. It is not just snow, it is strategic geography. Long border, Baltic pressure, northern routes, all of it. And once you say that out loud, the calmness feels even more intense. Like, thank you for being serene while standing next to a pressure cooker. That is the Scandinavian superpower, honestly. You know what surprised me most, though? They do not seem obsessed with winning big dramatic battles. They seem obsessed with making invasion miserable. That is such a brutal brand strategy. Come here and freeze, basically. No, seriously. Deterrence through inconvenience is genius. And you can see why that works against a bigger neighbor. Because size matters less if you can make every mile miserable. 1,000 kilometers of border is not a line. That is a commitment. A huge, cold, exhausting commitment. I also keep thinking about the bunker thing. That says the defense mindset is not just for soldiers. It is like the whole country is quietly rehearsing continuity. Yeah, continuity is the real luxury there. Not luxury, actually, the opposite of luxury. And that is why their happiness thing is so interesting. People always assume happy means carefree, but not here. Here it looks more like confidence plus preparedness. Or maybe acceptance, which is even stranger. Acceptance without defeat, that is the tricky balance. You sound like a philosophy professor in a snowstorm. I know, but it is true. And that NATO piece matters because it changes the psychology. They are not alone anymore, but they still act like they might be. That combination is terrifying and impressive at the same time. Basically, the perfect country to have on your side. Yeah, the friend who already packed, trained, and labeled everything. I think that is why the exercise feels so symbolic. It is not just soldiers in snow, it is a message. The message is, we know where we are and we are ready. And that feels older than NATO, honestly. Yeah, NATO is the tool, but the mindset came first. Which makes me wonder how much of national strategy is culture. A lot more than politicians like admitting, probably. Definitely more than press releases admit. Because culture decides what a population will tolerate, and what it will practice even when nobody is watching. That is the part that makes Finland feel so unusual. They made readiness normal without making it loud. The least flashy flex of all time. And somehow the most intimidating one. Bro, that whole giant orange bag moment is basically military capitalism in one frame. You think you are packing for a hike and suddenly you are a winter survival unit. And the insane part is they are not doing it for vibes. They are doing it because -40 will humble you. Most countries treat weather like inconvenience, and Finland treats it like an enemy force. That is such a scary sentence if you really think about it. Because if the cold can kill your army before a bullet does, the cold is the first battlefield. Exactly, and that is why the whole layering thing feels so basic and so profound at once. Like they are teaching survival before strategy. Which is rude, honestly, because the snow did not ask to be promoted to general. No, but that is the point. The environment gets a vote there. And that reserve system changes everything, because the country is basically saying everybody stays available. That creates a totally different relationship to security than a place with a small professional army. In some countries, defense is outsourced emotionally as much as financially. Emotional outsourcing is a crazy phrase, but yeah, that's exactly it. Finland seems like the opposite, where preparedness is just civic hygiene. And then you add NATO on top, and suddenly those drills stop being local theater. You have Americans, Canadians, Nordics, everybody learning the same frozen lesson. That is wild because the US troops are coming in from Alaska like, yep, this is the class. Imagine flying to the Arctic to be told you are not cold enough yet. But that interoperability stuff matters, because if the frontier ever gets hot, no one has time to improvise. Right. And Russia watching all of this has to be part of the calculation. Absolutely, because deterrence is partly about message and partly about muscle memory. The fascinating thing is how calm the whole country seems while living with that pressure. That calm is probably built, not natural. Yeah, happiness plus bunkers is a very funny national brand. But maybe that is the secret because being ready all the time makes panic less necessary. Or at least it gives people something sturdier than denial. And that is why the whole story hits so hard, because it is not just training. It is a society rehearsing its own survival without acting dramatic about it. Which is honestly cooler than any chest-thumping parade. Yeah, and way more believable.